If there's one thing historians of American education don't agree on, it's the factors that led to the feminization of the teaching profession. They all agree that teaching became an occupation, overwhelmingly associated with women and femininity. Really no debate there, but there is still a debate as to what actually caused it. What we also know is that the feminization of teaching took place over a long period of time, and that the change didn't take place everywhere all at once in the same way. Regional differences played a big role in how quickly teaching became feminized. So our goal today is to examine how teaching came to be viewed as feminine and what factors in American history accelerated that change. We'll also discuss the perception, role, and definition of teachers from the colonial era through the recent past, because the story won't make sense without it, and it honestly sounds like a lot of fun. If you watched my little video about the Common School movement, then you have some idea of how schooling and teachers looked in colonial America. Most education during the colonial period was given informally in family homes by parents or at businesses as apprenticeships. Churches, they operated schools for the poor as charity and for moral and Christian instruction. Most children became literate so that they could read the Bible. And upper middle class families, they hired tutors or paid to send their children to schools run by individual schoolmasters. And the families that did pay for education expected their teachers to have a social background and value system similar to their own. And most of those students were white and male and Protestant Christian. And as a result, teachers as a group in colonial America were overwhelmingly white and male, largely middle class and young, and often, though not always, they were well educated. As you could imagine, women, they did not receive as much education as their male counterparts in colonial America, and their illiteracy from a lack of education restricted their participation in teaching. In about the late 1700s, the estimate of women's literacy in colonial America was at about 45%. 45% of all women could read, meaning 55% of all women in colonial America were illiterate. But of course, as colonial America grew into the early republic, the public began to view that women should be educated. That's sort of a worthwhile thing, because there's no way for women to read and learn the Bible or teach the Bible to their children if they didn't know how to read. And so the public began to view basic education for women as a good thing, so that they could pass on religion and moral values to their children. So for the first part of American history, women were not involved in education, teaching, really at all. And it wasn't until about 1800, the turn of the 19th century, that you begin to see women even stepping into the classroom as teachers. And this period between 1800 to 1850 was a really wild time in American history. And in that 50-year period, there were a multitude of social and institutional reforms, including public schools, as cities began to industrialize and white Americans came to look disfavorably upon immigrant customs and beliefs. One of the benefits for the push for public schools was that white women's literacy rates nearly matched men's by 1850, and women began to have a larger role in primary education, especially in urban areas. Girls and boys were taught together in classrooms by the 1850s. And due to the expanded number of students overall, women began teaching younger children in the classrooms because there simply were not enough teachers in urban areas with growing immigrant populations to cover all the teaching jobs. And in more rural areas and in the South, because there wasn't as much immigration there and population growth, still had issues of segregation and just a kind of different idea of the view of women, men still accounted for a large part of the teaching force. So between 1800 and 1850, that's when you start seeing women primarily in urban areas in the Northeast taking on the role of teaching, but really only in the elementary areas. Another important factor that's pushing white women into teaching was an ultra-domestic feminine ideal that reigned supreme over white America during this 50-year period, known as the cult of domesticity and true womanhood. Women, they were supposed to be guardians of virtue and to build domestic, pure homes, while isolating themselves from a world that was growing more coarse and further away from religion. Society, American people, white American people, recognized the values of female nurturance as well as discipline in education. Teaching was a way in which women could work outside their own households while still being examples of purity and nurturance to young children. Then there's the economics of the situation in urban areas. With more students in more schools, there was a need for more teachers, supply and demand. Most public schools had shoestring budgets that provided really shitty wages for teachers.
I guess nothing's really changed.
For educated white men, there were just more lucrative occupations that can make more money. For the new supply of educated women, teaching was about the only occupation available for them. And so throughout the first half of the 19th century, Americans began to cultivate this idea that young white women were supposed to be pious, pure, submissive, and domestic, and were generally expected to become mothers. And that is why, until about 1950, if you were a married woman, or if you were a mother, you were not in the teaching field. You had a child, if you became pregnant, or if you got married, you would often lose your job as a teacher. And as young women, these teachers, especially on the Western frontier, they were considered the guardians of religious virtue. They were civilizing and bringing God to those around them. And they did that by educating young children. So, between 1800 and 1850, you see two things happening. In urban areas in northeastern United States, young unmarried women were becoming teachers due to a teacher shortage in areas with growing populations that were also educating women in the classroom. You also see young unmarried women serving as teachers on the frontier and in some rural towns, especially those that didn't have a teaching population to pull from. What links both groups of women together is the idea that women were the cult of domesticity and were considered the guardians of religious virtue. So between 1850 and 1900, if we finish out the 19th century, the major changes taking place during that time were rooted in the first part of the 19th century. Westward expansion, immigration, and industrialization. School districts, especially in cities, they kept growing to keep up with changes. States and federal governments, they eventually took a greater role in regulating and strengthening schools because there was just such an overwhelming need for public education in urban areas with massively growing populations. That, of course, led to a greater demand for teachers and the rapid feminization of teaching, especially in urban areas. So just to quickly recap, the second half of the 19th century is just an expansion and a proliferation of what was already taking place at the beginning of the century. It's that 19th century plot line where women begin to teach because of teacher shortages and the low salary associated with teachers in urban areas, combined with the westward expansion and need for public education in places where there were few people to teach. What you also see happening at the turn of the 20th century, especially in the urban north, was more formalized, structured schooling with more female teachers and sharp pay differences between men and women. Usually in the urban north, there were male principals that were employed to deal with disciplinary problems that their female teachers supposedly weren't able to handle. Feminization, something we saw earlier, it occurred more in the younger levels of school, with the majority of women teachers working in elementary school because of this societal belief that women are meant to work with children. And here's where some disagreement among historians creeps into our story. The transition to formal schooling, the higher threshold for teacher participation, the improved opportunities for men within education and outside of education, and the low cost of women teachers are important factors leading to the feminization of teaching. Historians will debate whether it's one of them or maybe both of them, but there are some like me who believe it's all of those factors. Universal education certainly drove the demand for teachers. I get that. But it's important to keep in mind that poorer rural schools still largely hired men to head their classrooms due to a lack of other economic opportunities or due to the sporadic nature of schooling because it conflicted with farming schedules. Feminization of teaching undoubtedly happened in the urban north, among other places, but it wasn't a full-on national phenomenon that took place at the same time everywhere all at once, if that makes sense. What we should also note too is that women did not receive the same esteem and prestige for teaching as men did. I mean, as soon as women got into the classroom, things like setting the curriculum and being in charge of discipline were slowly stripped from teachers as the profession feminized. The appearance of women in teaching created a two-tiered system of employment and education, one in which women did the bulk of the teaching under the supervision of an increasingly authoritative cadre of male administrators. And it's that theme, the two-tiered system of employment and education, and the growth of the infrastructure and bureaucracy around education to handle things like curriculum and policy and discipline. Those things that started in the last part of the 19th century into the 20th century, they go into warp speed. between 1900 and 1950, because that's also when you start to see compulsory elementary and secondary education of all American children. And it's within this time period, between 1900 and 1950, within all schooling, that you see the gender divide in leadership roles between elementary and secondary schooling. The majority of women were teaching in elementary schools. The majority of men were teaching in high schools. But it wasn't just that. It was issues of leadership, too. Women constituted 62% of elementary school principalships in 1905. Men, almost 95% of all high school principalships and nearly all school superintendencies. I think all of this is important to understand because the feminization of teaching went along with a changing view of education in America. The big things I want you to take away from this is that as more women became teachers, because they were becoming more educated, and because there were very few occupations that women were allowed to do, teaching as a profession came to be viewed as overly feminine. But the reasons it became overly feminine were completely out of the control of women. Society expected women throughout the 19th century to be models of virtue in instructing morality to children. We were viewing women as representatives of the Bible and how they could instill the lessons from the Bible in the classroom. And as the 19th century turned into the 20th century, the morality and religiosity of femininity and teaching, that all sort of got pushed away. But what still remained was that women were supposed to be virtuous and working with children. What I'm asking you to consider is if society views teachers the way it does because of how feminized the occupation of teaching is. Does the way society views women influence the way society views teachers? Does society view occupations that are traditionally feminine as less prestigious than occupations that are traditionally masculine? Does teaching have a relatively low status as an occupation because it's an occupation mostly worked by women? These questions aren't easily answered, but none of the questions in this course are. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this little romp down the road of the history of American education, and it got you thinking about something you hadn't considered before. I really appreciate you stopping by and giving me so much of your time. Until we talk again, be well and take good care.